What would interdimensional warfare look like? It might look like an empty field, a silent place. It wouldn't look like much of anything at all. It might look like all of your friends and loved ones being picked off, one by one, before you ever realize that there's a struggle afoot. If you tried to sound the alarm and bring it up to people, they wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. They'd call you a crazy person. What would spiritual warfare look like? It would look like interdimensional warfare, but with permanent consequences. There really is only one story. We think there's a separation between us and things from the past because of the way that we experience time. But the reality is that there is only one story, and we are experiencing fractal iterations and manifestations of something that happened long ago. However, nobody said the single story that is doesn't have multiple acts, and I would like to present you with the first act of this story.
Gym Trigger Episode.
Gym Trigger Episode.
Gym Trigger Episode. Gym Trigger Episode.
Once upon a time, I didn't believe in much of anything. I spent all my free time getting high and being a chud, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. I had the rest of my life ahead of me, whatever that meant, and thus I boldly stepped forward and took a job as a pizza delivery boy. The owner of the place was named Jim. Jim was alright, and he never cheated me or anything like that. He couldn't say the same about me, though. I really screwed around in that place. Anyway, Jim and I got on well enough, but he always thumped his Bible. He came across like someone who went to the kind of church where people worked themselves up into mindless frenzies and put on stupid, gross displays. One slow day at work, Jim told me how it was that he'd gone on to become a believer. He told me that when he'd been a young man, much like myself, he found himself not believing in much of anything, much like myself. One of his buddies invited him to a church service that was held in some place that I imagine looking like the tent church in season 1 of True Detective. Whatever the case, Jim decided to go, and so he took his buddy up on that invitation. So there Jim was, watching everyone around him as they hyped themselves up. They were babbling incoherently and acting all sorts of stupid. Then, all of a sudden, Jim felt something. In a flash, it became clear to him that the contents of the Bible were true, that this particular collection of books contained incomparable truth, and that it wasn't all fairy tales and superstition. However, that isn't all that happened. Immediately on the heels of that epiphany was something else, something so close in timing that he probably didn't distinguish it from the realization he'd just come to. Jim was hit with an overwhelming desire to speak in tongues. I don't mean that he spoke actual languages, or in any actual tongues, or even in an actual tongue. I mean it in the way that it's so often used today. Jim made meaningless sounds and, in fact, did the exact opposite of speaking in tongues. Since he felt so strongly compelled to behave in this way, he did so, for hours, and hours, and hours. And that was the story of how Jim had become a believer. Well, Jim's story sounded stupid and contrived to me. If he was the type of person who believed this stuff, then I wanted nothing to do with it, I thought. However, I could recognize one thing at the time, which was that he definitely believed everything he was telling me. I could at least recognize that, even if I thought everything he said and believed in was stupid. At the time, I just wrote off his personal experience as some kind of episode of zealotry, as some sort of self-induced psychosis or the like. I was many years away from realizing that a certain axiom, a certain rule, had been demonstrated the night that Jim had become a believer. And that axiom is this, that the counterattack always comes after the good thing. But we'll touch more on that later, homies. So, that was the Jim. The trigger was my manager at the pizza place, a big old girl that we'll just call Girl. She was a sweetheart and she had a one-of-a-kind personality, but she was also 1.5 absolute units, to put it lightly. We had become friends, which was all I was interested in. We both smoked tons of the crazy lettuce, and so we'd often spend our free time outside work, being baked potatoes. Sometimes we'd toss back a few burrs too, therefore becoming loaded baked potatoes. Badum-tis. Something evil was brewing though, and I didn't realize it. Girl wasn't just interested in my awesome company and dank wit like I'd thought. She wanted something else. She had a hankering for a beef stick, and she would only settle for one that was Dev flavored. Introducing Dev's beef sticks, made with 100% soft. Anyway, let's move on for a moment. We've covered the gym as well as the trigger, aka girl, and now here's episode. My older brother, Nevin. Nevin was a few years older than myself, and he and several of his roommates lived about an hour away in the city. Nevin had done well in community college for the last few years, and he was getting ready to go off to big boy school. He was working 3 jobs, had a lot of grant and load money coming his way for college, and he had developed a nice little amphetamine addiction in his free time, which was now the nighttime, when he would have otherwise been sleeping. You'd be surprised how much extra time you can find in your routine if you simply remove sleeping from the menu. Yep, that's right. Oh hey, America, you just elected President Devin for a 4-year term? Tell you what, I won't sleep at all, and I'll get everything done in just 2 years. After all, how hard can it be to write a $38 billion check to Israel? Ayo! Even worse, I enabled Nevin's habit. I was such an idiot and such a chud that I didn't recognize the obvious warning signs that he was demonstrating. When we did see each other, I usually wanted pot, and he usually wanted money to get uppers, and so the two often overlapped. In fact, one fateful day, Nevin informed me that he had acquired a sizable... Whoa, hang on. Every now and then my computer picks up, I guess, radio signals or something, which isn't anything that exciting. But while I was recording this, I heard what you just heard, and it actually got recorded. How about them apples, Dale? Anyway, one fateful day, Nevin had informed me that he had purchased a sizable amount of magic mushroom candies, magic mushroom chocolates, and he wanted to know if I would like to purchase some of his wares. I eagerly let Girl, my manager from the pizza place, know about it, and she was super excited. Girl had never tripped before, unlike me, and she was a real eager beaver about this. Girl wanted to trip together, which was understandable, but I only later realized what she was up to. See, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, the last thing on my mind whenever psychedelics entered the picture is the sexy time. The last thing I want to do is take a giant summer sausage and stir it around in a cup of pudding when my mind is bent in that particular way. But Girl, poor, innocent, naive Girl, she knew nothing about this. Her plan was to rent a motel room for us to trip in, and not just any motel room. Girl rented a room in the second worst motel in town, cause it was extra cheap. She figured we'd get up, trip together, then she'd lure me into spending the night, and ultimately we would do the sexy. I didn't even see it coming. Anyway, after work that night I got up with old Girl, and we began to do a trip. We tripped hard, yo. We did the tripping, and we even infused with marijuana blocks while doing the tripping, and then we cracked open some beers, cause I am hardcore and come from the streets, and we drank the beers. At some point it started to become obvious that she was looking for a romantic in, and so I was like, hey Girl, you know what? I'm good to drive. I'm gonna head back to my place. She was crestfallen, which is a word that I've never used before until just now. Give it up for crestfallen, everybody. Anyway, crestfallen was upset that I didn't want to stay, but she kept her cool. Or at least, I thought that's what she was gonna do. As I left the motel room and went to my car, she followed me and promptly planted the most unreciprocated kiss of my life right on my lips. After I gently rejected her with obviously contrived excuses about not being able to do the sexy because I forgot to wear my sexy time shirt or something, she went back towards the room, which she now realized she had locked herself out of. Being that I didn't want to completely douche it up, I decided to accompany her to the motel clerk on duty to see if she could get another room key. Only, we were both in the middle of tripping. And if you've ever dabbled with psychedelics, you might recall that explaining even the simplest of things to someone who isn't tripping suddenly becomes the most difficult thing in the world. This bewildered Indian clerk was looking at us like we were crazy, and due to the language barrier and completely spastic behavior on the part of myself and Girl, this guy was not happy. A simple, hey man, I locked myself out of my room. Can I get another key card or can you help us get back in? Turned into a 20-minute long back and forth. At one point, the clerk became obviously angry, and it was because he thought that I was spending the night with her. Yep, that's right, it was one of those places. If you rented a room with 2 beds in it, obviously it was a different story. But if you rented a 1-person room and declared that you were only looking for lodging for 1 person, then the staff wouldn't be happy if they caught you cheating. And that's what this guy thought we were doing. So, while tripping, while completely retarded, I had to explain to this guy, in front of poor Girl, that I had no intention of spending the night with her for a second time. You could probably imagine how awkward that conversation was. Anyway, she made it back into her room, and I made it home. It was around 4 a.m., and I texted Nevin a little bit about what had happened. I remember that he replied with a single sentence, and I didn't think much of it. That was that, I thought, and I went to bed. The next day was uneventful, but the following night, once again around 3 or 4 a.m., I noticed that my phone was ringing. Who the hell was calling me at this hour, I thought? Well, Nevin was, so I answered, wondering what was going on, and it rapidly became clear that something was horribly wrong. His tone and attitude was really off. Nothing he was saying made any sense. Something profound had happened, he communicated. He had encountered something, or met something, or interacted with something. He began telling me that everything was real, that magic was real, that the paranormal was real, so on and so forth. I had never witnessed a person in such a state before, and I had no idea what to do or say. He told me that whatever he'd encountered had told him something, some phrase or word that made everything clear. So naturally, I asked him what that phrase or word was. His attitude shifted and became even more unusual, and he told me that he couldn't tell me what that word or phrase was because I'd probably naively say it, thinking everything would be awesome, and then I'd get myself into some kind of trouble. I had no idea what that meant, and I started to get pissed. Part of me thought he was just being a jackass, and that he was still mentally in control, and I was irritated with him for being so weird. The gist of the call was that something strange had happened to him, that he had met something or encountered something otherworldly, non-human, and that he had something profound to share with people. Whatever it was that he had to share, it was so profound that he had told me the following. He had almost burst into his house, where all his roommates were sleeping, at 3 or 4 in the morning, in order to wake them up and tell them all about what had just happened. But he said that before he went inside the house, he realized that if he opened that door and stepped inside, that everybody was going to be killed. I can't recall if he specifically said that he would have killed everyone if he went in, or that just somehow him going in was connected to people dying. But anyway, I took it at the time as him being homicidal, or potentially homicidal. He was so argumentative and aggressive that I ended up losing my temper. He was being evasive and not providing adequate information, and he was beating around the bush, and I had no idea what the hell any of this junk meant. I ended the call angrily, and afterwards I decided that I had to find a way to bring this to my old man's attention the following day, and with that on my mind, I went to sleep. The next day when I woke up, Nevin was there, sitting on the porch. I could tell as soon as I saw my old man that he recognized that something was wrong, and he preempted my concern by coming up to me and telling me that Nevin had called him in the early morning and had said that something was wrong with his head and that he basically needed somewhere to dry up. My dad, despite being out of his depth, was no stranger to what chemicals can do to people. So he had told my brother, sure, no problem, come on over, stay as long as you need to, sober up, do what you gotta do. As grateful as I am to have had a dad like that, I should nonetheless make it clear that no one in my family knew how to deal with things of a mental or perceptual nature. Sure, bad trips happen and all that, right? But none of us had any experience with the sorts of problems we were going to be facing. I expected Nevin to possibly be completely lucid that very morning, that maybe he had a strange, drug-induced dream or something, and that he was sobering up and gently landing back on Earth. But nope. As soon as I talked to him, it was clear that even though he could move around, drive, talk, and act, he wasn't all there. Even as a kid, when I'd see someone stuck in a loop, so to speak, namely when it was a tragic or pathetic loop, it would bother me to no end. It's like, if you see someone with a giant gaping wound, blood pouring out, you know to treat it or to call for help and all that there's tangible, identifiable steps you can take to deal with that wound. But when it's your mental wear that has a hole in it, it can be the most heart-wrenching thing imaginable to witness. Nevin didn't go back to being regular Nevin that first day, or the second, or the third, and the days turned into weeks. It seemed like Nevin was never going to come back. Oh my God, I thought. My brother is broken and I can no longer commune with him. Even though his vessel is still breathing, even though he is still legally the same person, it's not Nevin. Even worse, he was still using drugs. And because no one in my family, myself included, knew how to deal with the situation or how to communicate well, Nevin didn't exactly get better. But he could technically function, And I mean technically. Sure, if you told him to wash dishes or something, he could wash dishes. But his thinking was psychotic, delusional, and illogical. It just so happens that much of the world is perfectly willing and able to abide such a state in someone, as long as a person can punch a clock. And Nevin could do just that. My old man had grown up in an era where mental health issues meant the end of the line for most people, and so he encouraged Nevin to go back into the world. Nevin worked and set the stage for that big boy college he was about to go to, and eventually he left. As he did so, I felt sure that my brother was gonna die as soon as he was out there on his own. Well, to get to the point, Nevin didn't die, thankfully, though he did come close on more than one occasion. No thanks to me, either, as I had basically cut off contact with him, as I couldn't bear to witness the crash playing out in slow motion right in front of my eyes. Months passed, and then more months passed. Remember how I mentioned that Nevin had a bunch of grant and loan money coming his way for college? He had made all these arrangements when he was still wearing his mind. And he had worked it out so that he could use the college shekels to get by the first 1 or 2 semesters there without having to work too much. Well, now that his eggs were scrambled, now that he was dealing with addiction, that money went quick. And therefore, so did his lodging. And therefore, so did all his possessions. Before long, he was staying in a homeless shelter and then attending classes in the morning and day. All the while, he wasn't computing right, and frankly, it's a miracle that he survived. Thank God for that. I'm glad, broski, and I'm sorry you went through that. Gradually, over what seemed like forever, he began to become his old self again. When he had showed up at my dad's house in need of help, I had noticed something strange. He would ask to use my computer every now and then, and he would spend hours and hours doing nothing. He would maybe create a single folder and then label it, and then he would create 1 or 2 text files within it, but all in all, he would do nothing. He would just stare sometimes, even. Well, I had missed how it all progressed over the duration of time that he was staying at my dad's before going off to college. He had actually written some material, and he had named it. Well, if you fast forwarded several months from then, or maybe even a damn year, when he started to seem like himself again, he was currently entering some sort of creative phase at the school he was attending, and he and several other people were putting on a production revolving around, guess what? The same piece of material that he had been working on while staying at my dad's, that he had come up with in the midst of his episode. All of this happened over a decade ago. Since then, Nevin's just been Nevin. I rarely brought it up as it was obvious that he didn't like talking about it, which he would tell you himself. One thing had stuck with me though. After he had come out of it and had become fully lucid again, he reiterated something about that night. When he had been about to storm into that house where all those sleeping people were, something terrible really would have happened had he gone in. I can't remember exactly how he worded it over the years, but whatever he said had left me with the impression that if he'd gone inside, he would have killed everyone in that house. Whatever it was that prevented him from going in, that mental image he got of everyone being dead, it was enough to halt him even as he was in that psychotic state. I had thought that I would be able to tell you this entire story in a single 20-minute video, but that ain't gonna work. This is going somewhere, and I promise you, if I execute this story correctly, you're gonna drop a load in your pants when I tie it all together in the next installment. With some of the stories I tell, honestly, there's just so much table setting required beforehand that I could now spend an entire 20-minute video just setting the stage in order to tie everything together. But I'm gonna try to do this right, and I'm gonna try to make it impressive, because if I tie this knot beautifully, you'll see what I'm getting at. And by the way, Jim is not a goofball, and I'm not judgmental about Jim, though what I presented to you today was just that. But Jim's not a bad guy. Jim's not a fool. Jim's not what you think he is, and this will come back in Act 2. Just to be clear, I'm not saying speaking in gibberish and calling it talking in tongues is cool, oh no. But you'll see once I explain it. Nevin is definitely gonna be in the next installment because he is highly involved in how everything came full circle. I only recently found something out that I want to leave you with before I head out. When Nevin was in the midst of that episode, when he had just freshly interacted with whatever it was he may or may not have interacted with, it wasn't his roommate's home, it wasn't his home that he was about to storm into. Apparently, he was about to storm into my father's home, and he only halted because something told him, clearly, suddenly, that if he went in, he was going to kill us. Anyway, on the off chance that Jim sees this, Jim, I'm not going in the direction that you probably think I'm going with this, so just be patient, man. I think you'll appreciate these videos if you do happen to see this. And, Nevin, I'm gonna try to treat what you told me fairly, and I'm definitely not trying to cast judgment or shade on you or anything like that. But, for both you guys, Jim and Nevin, I will be sharing my theories about things that happened to you. So feel free to call me out on it. There's a chance I'm wrong, right? But there's also a chance that what I will be talking about will help illuminate this stuff for you guys. I don't know. We'll see, right? I understand that not everyone's gonna agree with me on the spiritual stuff, the biblical stuff, but it's up to you how you want to contextualize it. But there are absolutely beings out there that hop into us, or they do things to us. I've seen people when it's not them anymore, and it's something else in their body, and it has to acclimate to its surroundings, and that's reflected in their behavior. These things step into us like suits at times, and there's a learning curve or some time for them to get used to things. I've noticed that some of the traits from whatever domain they come from seem to affect them initially when they hop into a human. For instance, if they presumably came from a place that's very dark, without much literal light, the person they initially hop into might suddenly experience light sensitivity. This is no joke, but I understand how kooky this sounds. We'll talk about all this more later. But believe it or not, no matter your ideology, we are in a war. I could imagine some waspy, inept, overly technical CIA documents. Oh, we are in a dimensional conflict. We are dealing with interdimensional entities. We do not yet know if they are willing to support Israel as much as we do. Fuck the CIA. Fuck Israel. These things aren't random. These things are not new. There's not a whole chaotic ecosystem of everything but what is laid out in the Bible. These things come from a place that at one time was called, or perhaps still is called, heaven, which is a place that has technology and means and capabilities that will make us all shit our pants. Take human technology, right? And then just going off like pop culture, what's above it? You know, alien technology, right? Imagine that alien technology is a lesser imitation of what those things dealt with when they were out there, up there, in heaven. That when these beings were put behind a veil or kicked out or demoted or ripped out of their bodies and cast into a spiritual void, they took that knowledge with them that they had from that higher place. They didn't forget what they had learned in heaven, and so with their clever and conniving ways, they've developed suits for themselves and machines. They've developed a methodology. They've developed covers and alibis, tactics, maneuvers. You can choose to stick your head in the sand and refuse to see what's going on. And anyway, whether or not you think I'm crazy, I don't give a fuck. Because one way or another, we all have choices to make. Alright, homies, I'm out.